Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be making jeans. And this pattern includes multiple sizes ranging from 30 all the way up to just under 40. And it's very easy to tweak this pattern to your exact measurements. And that's what I highly recommend doing. When you actually make a pair of pants to your exact measurements, the pants are so comfy. Better than anything you're gonna find at the store, because most of the sizing in stores is just a generic size so they can manufacture it. So I highly recommend going off your measurements for the best results. And this pattern is on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna wanna grab 2.5 to 3 yards for your main fabric, and that's depending on the size you're making. And I recommend using denim, twill, or corduroy. These are all really nice fabrics to use for pants. I'm gonna be using a lightweight denim. It's super breathable and it's also easy to work with when we get to those bulky sections. So keep that in mind when you're buying the fabric. If you're using a heavier weight fabric, when you're putting on the loops at the end, it can be a little bit tricky if you're using a lighter weight sewing machine. But again, if you use a heavyweight needle, you should have no problem. Don't be scared to test fabrics, because who knows, you might find something that's really nice. You'll need 1/2 to 3/4 of a yard of interfacing, and again, this is also depending on the size you're making. The interfacing will be used on the waistband and the fly, so I recommend getting a lightweight to medium interfacing. Again, this is due to bulk. Once you add that heavier weight interfacing in with a heavier weight fabric, it can get really bulky. And if you do go that route, if you're making a super heavy duty pair of pants, I do recommend using a walking foot sewing machine. You'll need 1 jean button, and I'm using a 3/4 inch jean button. Feel free to use whatever size you want. You'll need 1 7-inch zipper, and this has to be a 7-inch zipper. You can mess around and try different sizes, but for this pattern, a 7-inch zipper works really nice. We're also gonna be adding grommets to the pockets, and this is gonna be a snap button grommet, but it's only gonna be one side of the button. And this is a style used on most jeans. So what I did, I ordered a whole button kit with a few different finishes. I'm actually gonna be using these buttons in other projects, so they're not gonna go to waste, but I'm gonna be using just one of the sides, and we'll get more into this later on. And again, this is optional, so feel free to skip this supply. Lastly, you'll need your pattern, and this pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And after you printed out your pattern, before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after you gathered your supplies and printed off your pattern, it's time to move into cutting.
And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. And with all the pages, you really want to make sure your printer is aligned. If your printer is aligned, then the pages should line up perfectly. And after cutting, you should end up with 2 main back panels cut out of your main fabric. Be sure to cut with the correct grain and your correct size. When it comes to the leg width and length, this can be determined right here or later on down the road, so you can cut a little bit wider and a little bit longer and take it in later on. I did make this pattern a little bit wider so that way it's easier to take in. And these panels should mirror each other. Same goes for the main front panel, cut 2 out of your main fabric, and if you changed any width or length to the back panel, do the same thing for the front panel. These panels should be mirrored as well. You'll need 2 left side fly panels, 1 cut out of your interfacing and 1 cut out of your main fabric. 3 right side fly panels, 1 cut out of your interfacing and 2 cut out of your main fabric. 2 pocket back panels cut out of your main fabric. 2 front pocket lining panels cut out of your main fabric. 1 belt loop panel cut out of your main fabric. 2 back pocket panels cut out of your main fabric. 2 back yoke panels cut out of your main fabric. 1 inside pocket panel cut out of your main fabric. 3 left side waistband panels, 1 cut out of your interfacing and 2 cut out of your main fabric. 3 right side waistband panels, 1 cut out of your interfacing and 2 cut out of your main fabric. Moving on to construction, the first thing we're going to do is apply the interfacing to our left and right side waistband panel. And we're only applying it to one side of each panel, and make sure they're the correct sides that line up with one another. And an easy way to tell is to look at the curve and make sure the curves line up. And repeat this process for the left and right fly panels. Same goes for the right, we're only going to be applying it to one of the right panels. And we're using just a standard iron-on interfacing. It's super easy to use and really stiffens up the fabric. And that's going to complete the interfacing. I just like to get that out of the way in the beginning. Next, we're going to grab both of our front pocket lining panels. along with both of our main front panels. Find the curved edge at the top of our main front panel, do the same for our pocket panel. We're going to place the right sides together, lining up that curved edge, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do recommend pinning this panel down. It can be a little bit tricky sewing on the curve. And after you finish up that stitch, we're going to flip the wrong sides together, push that seam out from the inside to reveal the full curve. Make sure both panels are lined up precisely, and once you have them lined up, I highly recommend throwing a few pins in to keep them lined up, because we're going to be adding a top stitch, and I'm using an edge presser foot. This helps get a nice precise stitch along an edge. And the little tools like this really help pull out that professional look in your project. And we're going to start with one stitch right along that edge, and then switch back to the regular presser foot and stitch about a 1/4 inch away from our first stitch. Doubling up on the stitches really helps with the quality. Moving on, we're going to grab our inside pocket panel, and our main objective is to fold in all the sides to get rid of the raw edges. But before we do that, I want to actually just get rid of those raw edges by serging them, and this is going to help prevent fraying and make for an overall more quality pocket. If you don't have a serger, feel free to use a zigzag stitch. Moving on, we're going to start by hemming that top edge, so roll it over twice, a 1/4 inch, and then one more 1/4 inch. Add a couple pins, and from here we're going to add 2 top stitches. And we're going to do the same we did in the previous step, one close to the edge and one about a 1/4 inch away from our first stitch. After finishing the top, we're going to move to the bottom and then the side edges, and we're going to fold these in only once at a 1/4 inch. And we're going to grab our pocket back panel. And as you can see, the pocket placement is on the pattern, and we're only adding the inside pocket to the right side, so grab the right side panel. We're going to use the pattern to help us place the pocket. It has to go within the pocket perimeter placement. And lastly, stitch the outside edges, leaving the top open. Realistically, the inside pocket can be placed anywhere on the panel, so feel free to get creative with it. And be sure to add a nice tack stitch along that top edge. And the fun thing about these little panels is that you can actually make them out of different accent fabrics to really bring out a different design. And you can also scale this pocket to pretty much any size. Turn this pocket into something that's going to work and function for your use. Before we move on, we're going to add grommets to the top edge of that inside pocket. I'm using 1/2 of a snap button, and this is what you'll see on most standard mass-produced jeans. And feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to add these. So we're going to add them to the corners, and be sure to place it in between our top stitch. This kit came with a hole punch, so I'm going to start by hole punching through all the layers. Then I'm going to grab the back of my grommet, feed it through the hole, line up the top with the back on the right side of the fabric, and using the die, I'm going to hammer it into position. This kit also came with a die, so it's super convenient just to hammer these right on. And this step is primarily for looks. It does add a little bit of strength, but you're cutting through the fabric, so it is going to weaken that fabric, so it's pretty much a give and a take. Moving on, grab both of your main front panels, and we're going to line up the back pocket panel with our front pocket lining. And before we stitch these panels together, if you're working with denim, you'll see that it frays a lot, so we're actually going to serge the outside edges of all these pockets. If you don't have a serger, a zigzag stitch will work just as good. And it probably would have been easiest just to serge these 2 panels together, but since we're working with that curve, I just want to do it separate. So place the right sides together, lining up that curved edge, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside. After finishing one side, we're going to do the same thing for the opposite side. Once both sides are complete, we're going to flip it to the right side, line up the top and the side edges. And if for some reason the pocket's not lining up flush with the outside edge, feel free to trim it a little bit. And once you have it lined up, add a few pins, and we're going to stitch as close as we can to the outside edge just to lock everything into place. And this step is to primarily hold that pocket down and keep it from moving around for future steps. Before we go to the next step, we're going to take this quick opportunity to serge that top edge. You can skip the serging, I just think it makes it so much easier when we start assembling the panels. Next, we're going to begin working on the fly, so place the right sides together for our main front panels, lining up the curved edge at the top, and we're going to add a 1.5 inch tack stitch along that curve. We want to start at least 1.5 inches from the outside edge and then stop it right before that curved edge goes straight. Flip the panels open with right sides pointing up, and we're going to grab our right side fly panel, and we're going to line this panel up with the top edge and the inside curve with right sides together. And stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. From here, we're going to open up the panel and flip the wrong sides together. But before we do that, I'm actually going to clean that outside edge up by adding a serge. Again, this is optional, so feel free to add a serge or a zigzag stitch. With that edge cleaned up, we're going to flip it around so the wrong sides are facing each other. Line up and pin together the inside edge. and add a top stitch along the edge just like we did in previous steps. And before we start doing any work to the other side, again we're going to add a serge. The smart thing to do is serge these edges before we start stitching, but it's not always necessary to serge every single edge, so we're just kind of doing it as we go. So we're going to roll that edge over a 1/4 inch and grab our 7-inch zipper. This is the only zipper in the project, and I do highly recommend using a 7-inch zipper. It's just so much easier to work with because it lines up perfectly with that edge. Line the top of the zipper up with the top edge of the front panel, and the bottom should fall right into place, lining up with that bottom edge. You mainly want to make sure that zipper lines up with the top edge. If it's lined up with the top edge, then you should be fine. Do a quick check to make sure the zipper is secured to the edge, and from here we're going to grab our right side fly panel. We're going to start by assembling the fly panel, so place the right sides together and stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. With the panel stitched together, we're going to flip the right sides out by pushing that seam towards the outside. When you have the outside edges lined up perfectly and the curve is looking nice, we're going to add a top stitch to the outside edge. It may take a little bit of playing around with to get that curve looking nice. Next, we're going to serge the top and the side edge. This is going to pull both of these layers together to make it more of a uniform panel. We're going to bring the complete right fly panel over to our fly assembly and place it directly behind our zipper. Line the panel up with the top edge, and then that inside serged edge is going to line up directly with the inside edge of our zipper. Once you have it lined up, we're going to pin it down and stitch directly next to our first stitch. It doesn't have to be directly next to, we just mainly want to make sure we hit all the layers and that it's lined up evenly. Fold the left side of the fly over the zipper, and from here we're going to fold the entire panel over so the right sides are together. Fold the left fly panel down flat to line it up with the zipper, and where it lands is where we want to stitch it. We want it to naturally fall onto the opposite side of the zipper. And if done correctly, the right side of the zipper will be touching the right side of the left fly. After stitching, unzip the fly, open it up, double check to make sure everything lines up correctly. If so, the next step we're going to add top stitching to our left fly. And you can feel the outside edge of the left fly panel with your finger. So just kind of feel it out and mark along that outside edge. The main goal is to stitch it down and prevent it from flapping around. So once you have it marked, pin it down and add a top stitch as far as you can to the outside edge, and then we're going to add one more right along the inside edge. The last thing I like to do is to connect both of those stitches with a tack stitch. This area takes quite a bit of strain, so these extra stitches really help with the durability. Moving on, grab both of your back pocket panels. Just like the inside pocket in previous steps, we're going to start by hemming the top edge, so fold it over a 1/2 inch and then one more 1/2 inch. And the actual width of the hem can be adjusted to your preference. You can go bigger, smaller, it's totally up to you. And from here, we're going to add 2 top stitches, just like we did on our inside pocket panel. The fun thing about these pockets is that they're very customizable. You can add stitches going across, pretty much decorative stitches anywhere you want to really bring out a design you're going for. Just add your own flair to them. You can make them bigger, smaller. There's really no limit to what you can do. After adding your design, we're going to bring back our pattern piece and use it to mark out the stitch placement guide. This is going to become the inside stitch on our pocket. We're actually going to be adding 2 stitches for extra strength. And before we finish off the pocket, we're going to serge the outside edges. After cleaning up the edges, we're going to start by rolling the side edges in and then the bottom. You can do it the opposite way, it's totally up to you. Both ways work just fine. Grab your main back panels, and we're going to place the pockets about 3.5 to 4 inches down from the top edge, lining it up in the center of the panel. And you want to try to line these up perfectly if you're going for that uniform look, but realistically, you can place these along the back panel wherever you want. With the pocket set, we're going to start by stitching the outside edge just like we did in previous steps, giving yourself a nice tack stitch at the start and the stop. And for the second stitch, we're going to do the same thing, add a nice tack stitch at the start and the stop, but follow that inside marked line. If you are using a contrast color thread, it's really going to make the pockets pop. Next, grab both of your yoke panels. Line the back yoke up with the top edge of your back panel, making sure the taller edge is lined up with the curve, and we're going to place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to do these back to back so that way I get the seam allowance at the center perfectly lined up. This seam takes quite a bit of strain, so it is a good thing to add a serge or a zigzag stitch, just to give it a little bit more strength. And then we're going to flip the right sides open, point the seam allowance towards the top edge, and add a top stitch. This is another seam I like to double down and add 2 top stitches. And that's pretty common when it comes to manufactured jeans. And by all means, feel free to add more stitches to make it stronger. Lay out your front panels with right sides pointing up, and we're going to grab our back panels and line them up with the correct sides with the right sides together. And that's why we left 1.5 inches when we're stitching the fly, so we could easily line up our inside seams, giving us room to sew right through at the top. And once you have the edges lined up, we're going to stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance and try to replicate the same stitch on both sides. After stitching, we're going to double check to make sure that both stitches on each side look exactly uniform to one another. If they're looking good, we're going to move on and serge both of those inside edges. After serging, we're going to open up the panel to expose the seam, point the seam allowance towards the front panel, and we're going to add a top stitch all the way down that inside seam. And you have a few different styles of doing this. You can use a twin needle and do a double stitch right off the bat. If you want to step it up from a twin needle, you can get a double needle sewing machine, but this is going to give you that traditional look on the inside seam. I'm just going to be using a single needle and doing 2 stitches, so I'm going to start with one on the outside edge, and then for my next stitch, I'm going to move in closer to the edge and sew in between the edge and my first stitch. Again, this is totally preference. I like to do double stitches on that inside seam, but you can do 1 or you can do none. After repeating it for the opposite side, we're going to put the right sides back together, and we're going to line up our back panel curved edges. I like to start at the inside and work towards the top. If the yoke seams line up, you should be good to go. Add a few pins and stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're going to want to stitch all the way to the front panel, butting right up against the zipper. This is another seam that takes a lot of strain, so we're going to add a serge here, and I know it's hard to get right up to that zipper, so get as close as you can. If you can't get it with the serger, you can always go back with a zigzag stitch and get the spots you missed. After finishing up the serge on that seam, we're going to open it up so the right sides are pointing up and add a top stitch. And with this one, we're going to point the seam allowance towards the left side and run it all the way up just below the zipper. And this is another one I highly recommend. If you don't do any of them, I really recommend doing this one if that's the only one you're going to do. And I'm actually going to double up on this one again because this one's very necessary. And if you're going for extreme durability, you could even do a couple more stitches on this seam. Place the right sides back together, lining up the outside edges. Make sure the top edges are lined up on both sides, and we're going to add a stitch all the way down both those sides. Starting at 1/4 inch seam allowance will give you a lot of room to play around with when it comes to fitting. And typically the next step would be to clean up this raw edge by adding a serge, but before we get to that point, we want to make sure we have the correct fitting. So what we're going to do next is actually try these on inside out, so that way we can adjust the width. So you're taking them in from the outside seam, and what you want to do is taper them right above the thigh area, or wherever you think you want to start making adjustments. I'm actually going past the knee, so I'm going to start my tapering just above the knee. You want to give yourself a little bit of room and really smooth out that seam so it's not just a jagged in and out. So as you can see, I went up a little bit further than the knee so I can really smooth it out because I'm going in quite a bit. So the more you go in, the more you want to taper it. And you only have to do this to one leg because you can mirror it on the opposite leg, and an easy way to do this is lay them both out flat, fold it back, and kind of chalk along that line. And from here you can go ahead and work that stitch in, starting parallel with the stitch and slowly working into that new stitch line. With all the new seam allowance, you can go ahead and cut it off with scissors, or you can do what I'm doing and you can serge that entire edge and go right up against your new stitch, removing all that extra seam allowance. And after serging, I like to lay the pants out flat so I can kind of see to make sure both sides look uniform to one another. If everything's looking good, we're going to move towards the top opening, flatten out the pants so the side seam is pointing up, and we're going to point that seam allowance towards the back panel and add a top stitch all the way down towards the bottom. Going all the way down to the bottom is optional. Most companies will stop just at the pocket. It can be very tricky trying to get this top stitch all the way down to the bottom, so what I do is I go as far as I can and then I flip it to the bottom opening and then I meet it where I left off. If you can make it all the way to the bottom, that's totally cool. I just do it that way because it's a little bit easier. And again, don't feel like you have to go all the way down. You can just go right to the top of the pocket and be done. Before we go any further, we're going to serge the entire top edge, and we're actually going to jump at the fly. We're not going to sew the fly panels together because we want that to open. And by doing this, it brings all the layers together on that top edge, and it's going to make it so much easier to install the waistband. Moving on to the waistband assembly, we're going to grab both the left and right side waistband panels. We're going to start by sewing the back edges together, so grab both of your interfacing panels, locate the backside edge on both panels, place the right sides together, and just to be clear, we brought together a left panel and a right panel. Do the same thing for the opposite two panels without the interfacing, place the right sides together, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the best thing to do after stitching is to grab your pants and line it up with the top edge. Make sure the right waistband panel is coming out on the right side and the left on the left side. Line up the back center and just bring those panels around to the front to make sure they come all the way around. This is just a quick test to make sure our waistband panels are long enough. They can go past the panel, we just don't want them to be shorter. And it's always good to test this because if you changed any bit of the width, you always want to check to see if the waistband will still line up. After checking, we're going to flip the wrong sides up and flatten out the seam so that way seam allowance is on both sides of our seam. And we're going to add a top stitch to both sides of that seam. Repeat this for both waistband panels. And what we're trying to do here is make this panel as flat as possible so when we roll over, it's not too bulky and it's easy to stitch down. Next, we're going to add the panels to our pants, starting with the interfacing panel, but we want to make sure we're sewing the correct side, and we're going to sew the side that curves up. The curved side that points up is going to line up with the top edge of our pants. And make sure that the right waistband panel pops out on the right side of the pants and the left side on the left side of the pants. And this is because the right waistband panel is longer, so you need it to be on the correct side. The panels should go past at least a 1/2 inch or more, and if it goes past more, that's totally fine. We can trim them up later. Just make sure the seams are lined up in the back, and from here, we're going to stitch all the way around that edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The biggest mistake here is having your presser foot pressure set way too high, and it's going to push that fabric and stretch the waistband panel because the waistband panel is a little bit stretchy because it's cut on a bias. So just make sure you double check your presser foot pressure. After finishing up that waistband stitch, we're going to flip the right sides out, double check that waistband, make sure all the layers are looking good. If so, we're going to grab our second waistband, the one with no interfacing, line up the back seams on the waistband, wrap both sides around, make sure they line up correctly. And with this one, we're going to be sewing that side up, and then we're going to be sewing all the way around and back down the other side. But before we do that, we have to roll the bottom edges up a 1/4 inch on both sides. You may have to go a little bit more to adjust it to your waistband seam allowance, but from here we're actually going to start at the center and sew towards the outside edges. I found this to be the best technique if you don't have a walking foot. You technically want a walking foot because when you're working with this stretch in the fabric, it's going to pull one side more than the other and it's not going to be lined up. So starting at that center point and working towards the outside gives you more of an alignment. Next, I'm going to snip the corners to reduce a little bit of that bulk so those corners pop really nice on the waistband. After snipping the corners, we're going to flip the right sides out. So when it comes to corners, it's pretty tough to get a perfect right angle, so using scissors, a screwdriver, or something pokey to work that corner around and pop it out really helps. And when you pop the corners out, we're going to line the top edge up and make sure both of those edges are lined up perfectly. From here, we're going to add a top stitch going all the way around that top edge, starting at the front, going up, and then all the way around. We will be doubling up and adding 2 stitches, so add one pretty close to the edge and then one more about a 1/4 inch away from our first stitch. It totally is optional, but it really helps flatten out that waistband and give it a nice feel. Moving on, next we're going to finish up that inside waistband, and again this is the waistband without the interfacing, so we're going to fold that bottom edge over to match the waistband on the outside edge. And you can either press it or add pins. I'm going to do a little bit of both just because I really want it to be lined up correctly. And once you get both of those waistband seams lined up, we're going to add a top stitch all the way around. And that's why you really want to make sure it's lined up perfectly because you're going to be going blind to the opposite side when you're stitching. Again, I recommend starting at the center back and working your way to the outside edge. It's going to save you a lot of frustration if you don't have a walking foot sewing machine. So next we're going to line up the ends so we can figure out where we're going to place our button. Feel where the waistband panels intersect and then make your mark right in the center. This is where we're going to place our buttonhole. Most machines come with a buttonhole presser foot. And I'm going to show you how to set it up. So you're going to want to grab your button. We're just using a standard jean button. It's about a 3/4 width button. Place the button in the back of your presser foot. There's a little slot for it, and then you're going to slide your presser foot closed, and that's going to set the width of your buttonhole. The next thing we have to do is set up our machine, so you're going to want to switch it to the buttonhole setting. For the length, you also want to switch that to the buttonhole setting. The width you can play around with because this is actually going to change the overall width of the buttonhole. And I typically put the needle position in the center. Clip the presser foot on and pull down your top lever. With the lever down, I always do a test run before I actually go to my garment. In this way, you can also dial in the width so you can figure out the style you're going for. And once the buttonhole is complete, you just snip the center with scissors and you're good to go. At this point, I do always like to test it to make sure the button actually goes through. If the button goes through, then you're good to apply it to your garment. And once it's on your waistband, the next step is just to poke through to the other side, so you can get an exact marking on where to put your button. And since these are designed pretty much like a thumbtack, all you have to do is push it through the back end of your waistband and add the top half of your button. You'll want to push fairly hard to really secure it down, and after the button is installed, slide it through your buttonhole and you're good to go. I always like to wiggle it around just a little bit to make sure the button is on there secure and also the buttonhole is the right size. And as you can see, my waistband front is a little bit higher than my back. This is not supposed to be like this. It's supposed to be pretty flush. I accidentally went a little too heavy on the seam allowance, but I wanted to show you that you can adjust the width of the waistband to really get it to your personal liking. All these micro adjustments will make for the perfect fitting pair of pants. Moving down to the opposite side of the pants, we're going to finish off the leg openings. I do recommend serging before hemming, but for this one, we're actually just going to hem it. So roll that edge over twice, 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, hiding that raw edge. Make sure both of the leg panels are lined up evenly. If both leg panels are looking even, you can go ahead and add your stitch. And I'm going to start on the outside and then do my second stitch closer to the edge. And again, you don't have to go 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch. You can go bigger, you can go smaller. You can really just leave it raw too. It's totally up to you and the look you're going for. Moving into the last step, we're going to grab our belt loop panel. The pattern is split up into quarters and that's what we're going to work off of. So fold the outside edges to meet in the center. And then we're going to fold one of the sides over the center to cover up the raw edges. And I typically throw a few pins just in one side, and then as I start to sew, I can fold it as I'm going. And we're going to be adding 2 stitches, so after the first stitch, go to the opposite side and add a second stitch. And once you finish the second stitch, just double check to make sure it doesn't unfold in the center anywhere. If it's looking good, we're going to cut it up into 4.5 inch segments. You should end up with 5 that are exactly the same size, and the 6th one will be a little bit shorter. You can put that one off to the side. That one won't be used. I just made this pattern a little bit longer, so you definitely end up with 5. So we're going to roll these ends over and stitch it directly to our jeans. I like to place them directly next to the pockets on the front, one center in the back, and one on each hip directly in between the two. And again, with this step, you can add more belt loops if you want. 5 is the bare minimum. It gets the job done. But anyways, once you found your markings, we're going to stitch them all on the same way. We're going to line them up with the top edge and just right below the waistband. And sewing these on can get very bulky, so definitely use a heavy weight needle. Sewing the top on flat can definitely add a little bit of extra strength too. Finish sewing on the rest of your belt loops, and lastly, add your branding. And the coolest thing about this is that you can actually keep tweaking this pattern over time to really get the waistband right, to get the side fittings right, and making a few pairs to really dial in where you want the pockets, where you want the seams. And once you figure that out, then you're set for life. You'll no longer have to search for that perfect pair of pants because you'll be able to make them. And realistically, you can make them out of any fabric, so have some fun.
And there you have it, your jeans are done. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully your pants turned out good. I know mine didn't turn out great the first few tries. I really had to fine tune the pattern to get the fit and feel that I was looking for. And again, don't be afraid to tweak parts of the pattern because it really makes for the best fit because everyone is a different shape. So you really cannot have one size for everyone. You kind of have to manipulate this pattern to make it work for you. And hopefully I'll have a few more styles of pants coming down the line here. And like always, if you have any features you want to see added onto the pants, definitely comment that down below. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.
Gotta dream about it. Gotta find a way to do the things that make you feel the love. Gotta think about it, gotta dream about it, gotta find a way to do the things